my name is Lauren. I've been with the Department of Energy for 15 years and working in geothermal all that time. All right, so I'm so excited to be able to talk to you today about enhanced geothermal systems, which is what I spent the majority of my career at DOE working on when I joined in 2009. We kind of jumped right into a big EGS program, and I've since been lucky enough to kind of transition around the office, and I'm now lucky enough to be in this role where I get to look across the technologies and help promote them and ensure that we see deployment of all of them as a senior advisor. So I am going to, though, talk to you about enhanced geothermal systems and the potential, and then maybe touch on a little bit of heating and cooling, which is just too exciting to leave out. So if you, let me just make sure I can advance my slides. There we go. Okay. Hopefully you're seeing a big thermometer. So starting kind of with the basics, I think it's always really useful to start with what actually is geothermal, because something that, and one reason I'm so thrilled to be here, not only just to meet you all and commend you on what you do, but the opportunity to get to talk to new stakeholder groups is really important for us, because geothermal has an inherent challenge in terms of communications. Thinking about our sister renewables, you can see the sun, you can see wind blowing, you can see a turbine spinning, you can see a solar panel. Geothermal is all happening beneath the ground, and I think that creates an inherent challenge in understanding what it is. And so starting with kind of the idea of geothermal as a whole, rather than thinking of it as these disparate technologies that you may hear different things about, I think is really important for understanding how it all fits together and why it's important and why it can have such a big impact on, your lives and on the decarbonization future of this country and hopefully the world. So basically, the short story is geothermal is heat, and it's heat that comes from the earth. And from my perspective, a very nerdy one, I think it's very interesting and exciting because this heat has been around for, billions and billions of years, and will continue to be around for billions of years. So it's a virtually inexhaustible source of heat and power. And the deeper you go into the subsurface, the more heat there is. And geothermal energy is basically just taking that heat and utilizing it for useful purposes that benefit us. In some cases, though, you might see pictures of monkeys in Japan hanging out in hot springs. So hopefully we benefit the animals too. But so basically we see whether there's, looking at this thermometer, a little bit of heat, the bottom of the thermometer, or a lot of heat, there are myriad possibilities of what can be done with geothermal. So at this low end of the thermometer, on the cooler side, there is incredible opportunity for heating and cooling of homes. These are heat pumps that you might have in your backyard, geothermal heat pumps, not an air source heat pump, and they're working at 40 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And I'll talk about this a little bit at the end, but the opportunity here to decarbonize heating and cooling in our homes is really significant, and maybe not something that people think about that often. But heating homes and water heating makes up around 2/3 of our home energy use in the United States. And most of that demand in the United States, especially in the Eastern US, is met by natural gas. So in Europe, they're advancing decarbonization of heating and cooling dramatically. It's a high priority, and we're not there yet in the United States, but our office is really trying to push that. So I hope that I can convince you by the end of this talk that enhanced geothermal systems is going to be the future, part of the future decarbonization mix in the United States, and that we have to deploy heating and cooling as well. And the technology improvements that get us to EGS are going to help us get to more and more heating and cooling for you and your friends and neighbors. So as we move up that thermometer, you're going to see higher temperatures, and that can allow us to heat communities rather than just a house. We can warm greenhouses. We can extend growing seasons, in cold climates throughout the year. In Italy, they brew beer with geothermal, and New Zealand as well, and they're drying milk, so it can be, their amazing dairy products can be exported around the world. In Nevada, they're drying onions to make lots of different things, maybe the little crunchy onions that go on top of your salads. But there's a variety of purposes, including aquaculture, agriculture, critically, the opportunity to decarbonize industry where heat is needed for industrial processes, aside from just those I mentioned, big industry. There's some opportunities in terms of the aluminum smelting in places that have really high resources. So the opportunities here are amazing. And that's just in the middle of the thermometer. So once you get up to the top of the thermometer, when we get to the highest temperatures, we're talking about clean, dispatchable electric power. And some of these temperatures are incredibly hot. The temperatures at the surface of planets, of Venus, for example. But we're not necessarily talking about having to work in that environment. We can work from 300 or so degrees on to produce clean, dispatchable electric power that can power homes and businesses around the US. So this is where enhanced geothermal systems comes in. It's a power resource. And one of the reasons why we are working in EGS specifically is just because the US has so much stranded heat. And I say stranded heat because what I mean by that is basically, again, below your feet, you keep digging, you get to 4.5 miles depth. And this is kind of what across the United States would look like from a temperature perspective. So we have a lot of heat. The darker parts, the red and the purples are high heat flow, meaning lots of heat there. We have a lot of heat in the Western United States. We also happen to have a lot of conventional geothermal that I'll talk about in a minute, but this is where geothermal that can produce power right now exists. The opportunity to take advantage of that heat that isn't coming up to the surface in a geyser or in a hot spring expands our potential to work across the United States in areas where you see some of those red and orange splotches, even some of the light green. And what's exciting about that is just that there is this opportunity to advance and improve our understanding of the subsurface so we can be better equipped to tap into those resources and, again, open up the possibilities of geothermal use nationwide. So we're trying at DOE to innovate our way into accessing as much of that resource as we can. And again, what I mean when I say like why this matters, what I think this means for the American people is that it can be integrated into so many aspects of our lives for beneficial purposes, as I mentioned, with industrial processes, heating and cooling your home, providing hot water to your home, as well as power production. So our vision in the Department of Energy is to really take advantage of the stranded heat, produce firm, flexible, clean power, and enable heating and cooling for Americans. So if we zoom in on the power sector, as I mentioned, there's a lot of heated depth in the Western United States. And so this is what the power that's being produced in the Western US currently is around 3.7, 3.8 gigawatts of electricity. It's a very small percentage of the renewable generation in the US, but it happens to be the largest amount of geothermal produced by any country in the world, although some countries are quickly approaching us. So we have around 93 power plants in the Western US. And what's happening at these power plants is they're taking advantage of those conventional systems where we have hot water in the subsurface, we have that heat, and then we have pathways for fluid to flow. These are naturally created by geologic processes over time, and they happen to be in places where there's lots of historical tectonic activity. You've been to Yellowstone, maybe. You've probably seen this in Iceland. Alaska and Hawaii have tremendous resources. But you can also see that generation is currently limited to the Western US, massive resources in Nevada and California. And so we're trying to expand that, as I mentioned. So to help take advantage of all that potential, our office has some goals, and what Department of Energy basically does, I'll talk about on a later slide, but we're trying to support the nation's carbon-free electric grid using geothermal as a clean baseload dispatchable power source. We're trying to decarbonize those buildings and residential buildings because of the high energy use that goes into heating and cooling our homes and buildings. And then also something that really resonated with me in the intro is just the opportunity for social advancements of the energy transition. It's something we're so focused on right now, and geothermal has so much opportunity to provide economic benefits for communities that might have been negatively impacted by the energy systems in the past. So it's something we're working quite a bit on now and excited to continue to do in the future. And basically what we try to do is reduce the risk and the cost of getting geothermal deployed, all types of it, cut red tape, and increase awareness on what geothermal is. So the way we do that is we basically take in appropriations from Congress. Congress tells us how much funding we might have, and you can see this on the right-hand side of the slide. We decide what the most important strategic directions are, and you've just heard what our 3 goals are. And then we identify technology gaps and analysis gaps that are going to help us get there. And then we compete that money to the public, to academic institutions, state and local governments, industry, and national laboratories to try to make progress on those goals. And we currently have our office broken down into these 4 technical areas. One program we call data modeling and analysis. They focus on addressing barriers. How do we get more geothermal out there? Understanding what we should focus on next. Hydrothermal resources are those conventional resources that I mentioned during the Western US, and we want to be able to find more of them, and we want to be able to explore them and develop them for lower cost. Our low temperature program is looking at the bottom of that thermometer that I showed you. So things below 300 degrees, heat pumps, direct use, the opportunity to combine geothermal with solar, maybe with other hybrid technologies. And then this last piece, which is pretty neat, called thermal energy storage. So how can we use the ground as a big battery to help us? It's really good at doing that. And we can store heat, maybe from intermittent renewables over time periods, and then reuse it later, whether it's for power or whether it's even just for space heating. I saw an amazing example of this in the Netherlands recently, where they're storing heat and then they're using it to keep greenhouses running all year round, and are some of the largest producers, as you probably will know, of flowers in the world. So, and then finally, the last program, and I'm going to talk quite a bit about this today, is EGS, Enhanced Geothermal Systems, and that's the program I used to manage. So again, kind of starting with the power side, we're going to focus on that. Conventional geothermal is basically where we have that heat in the subsurface. We have pathways that are natural, where fluid is flowing, water that comes from the surface of the earth flows through fractures and cracks. It's rainwater, water from waterways, gets into that heated subsurface. And then in a natural system, it finds a way to come back to the surface, and it brings that heat back to the top, to the surface, where we can produce power from it. So the other side of that is enhanced geothermal systems, which is basically think of a man-made or a human-made version of a natural geothermal reservoir. So the way we create them is we inject fluid into hot rocks. We try to increase those natural connections that exist between and create fluid pathways in the subsurface for that water to flow. It picks up heat, and then we bring it up to the surface, and then we do the exact same thing you'd do in a conventional geothermal system, and in many power plants where we just use a turbine to produce power. And so that's the way that we're defining EGS at the Department of Energy. And the promise of it, as I've mentioned a couple times now, is to use those ubiquitous resources, heat resources that we have that are otherwise stranded, to develop firm and dispatchable carbon-free power across the country. So why do we care in general about geothermal power? This kind of goes for both hydrothermal and for enhanced geothermal systems, but I've used the term firm a couple times, flexible. These are terms that we throw around at Department of Energy. We used to say baseload, we don't say that anymore. And what it basically means is that we are able to produce power all the time, hence the clock that you see on the screen, whether it's sunny, when it's raining, whether it's nighttime, regardless of the weather, power is being produced. We also have the unusual ability to be able to ramp up and down, which can be very, very valuable to utilities who need generation sources that might not be producing power 24 hours a day, that have basically daily loads that come in when it's sunniest or when it's windiest, and seasonal load changes. So geothermal can help balance that, which is extremely valuable to grid operators. So that high capacity factor, which is that ability to produce consistently, and that operational flexibility is kind of pans out in a way that allows us to develop, in some cases, double or 4 times the amount of electricity that a wind or solar plant could do at the same capacity. And in California, they're valuing this very highly. It's one of the only states that's doing so. The California Public Utility Commission is mandating a gigawatt of renewable resources that have a capacity factor over 80. Geothermal is generally estimated to be around 90, because they need these baseload resources in order to balance out the grid stability. Also, where we happen to enjoy very efficient space-saving small footprints, as you can see on the chart on the right-hand side of the slide, because most of our work, as I said, some of our challenges also end up being a benefit. We can't see our resource, it's beneath our feet, but it also means that there's a lot less happening on the surface, which means it's a lot less land disturbance. It can happen, power production can happen in a smaller footprint than some other technologies per gigawatt. So another piece that we want to share, and I heard mentioned at the outset as well, is this opportunity for transitions of workers. The skill sets, the knowledge, skills, and abilities that are in, currently in the oil and gas industry, in many subsurface industries, are really one-to-one with geothermal. And so the opportunity for a transition in that space from displaced oil and gas workers or folks that are interested in a transition, that skill set is very unique. And these highly skilled folks and very skilled folks from the construction industry have a home in geothermal because of the overlap in needs for exploration, drilling, and construction in new geothermal plants, whether they're enhanced geothermal systems or conventional. And also the opportunity to, we've done some quick analysis on this and see around 300,000 gross jobs, although we're updating that analysis to make sure that we're accounting for the new deployment numbers that I'm going to talk about soon. So in terms of what we're doing at the Department of Energy, we're the largest funder of enhanced geothermal systems research in the world. Some other countries in Europe and Japan are quite interested in advancing EGS as well and are amazing partners in this space. But one aspect of our strategy is what we call an energy earth shot. So kind of like a moonshot, but this is the Department of Energy under the Biden administration's most recent goal for ambitious government-wide forward-thinking efforts to help advance technologies that can be critical in terms of decarbonization. And so we were lucky enough to have to launch an earth shot on EGS. It's one of very few. And we, as a part of that earth shot, had to develop a target. So what did we want the cost of an EGS to be in order to see deployment that was going to be valuable or significant in the United States, and what's the cost that's going to be most effective for people to actually utilize this type of power. So our analysis indicated that when we have technology improvements that I can talk about later that are very tractable, we can see around 90 gigawatts of deployment. And what that translates to is basically around 12% of power generation in 2050 of clean and dispatchable power for your house and for businesses and communities nearby. So the one point I want to make, and I'll continue to come back to, is that not only is this a crucial element of a carbon-free future, but this heating and cooling piece can be enabled, as I said, because of the opportunity to develop technologies that are going to translate into cheaper geothermal heat pumps. So what does 90 gigawatts look like when we actually pan it out on a map? It's so exciting. So our target is $45 per megawatt hour, which is kind of in the weeds, but that's a very reasonable cost of electricity compared to other technologies at this time frame. And when we apply that, as I said, with the technology improvements that we've been modeling, we see really neat deployment. We're well beyond the states where we see conventional geothermal, which is what our goal is, and the opportunity here to power a third of electricity demand in the West, which we know there's amazing resources out there. But this new development that's happening in the South and in the Eastern United States, in Virginia, West Virginia, and in Pennsylvania, is pretty neat. 4 gigawatts of deployment just in the Eastern US, which is more than current installed capacity of geothermal in the US today. So there's a real exciting opportunity for states that might be interested around the country where these resources are going to be at a cost that our modeling shows utilities will choose over other technologies because of their flexibility. Also, that exciting development that's happening in Texas, Louisiana, as well, Arizona, Arkansas, Mississippi, where we don't have any geothermal development right now. We have a tremendous amount of people that have expertise in subsurface technologies. And so great opportunities for job transitions and obviously benefits from the power. So you can see on the right-hand side of the slide some of what I was talking about earlier, not only the opportunity for power, but this opportunity for heating and cooling, and then this amazing opportunity for not only that transition of workers, but also bringing geothermal to communities that may have been negatively impacted by energy transitions historically. So kind of just would want to cover really quickly if it's so great, why isn't there more of a question, which I think is a very, very valid one. And having been with the geothermal industry now for 15 years, it's really interesting to see how interest ebbs and flows, and also how what we've made progress on in terms of barriers. So the community is unique in that it's very small. And I think that that's a big barrier, in addition to just the fact that there's the lack of awareness. But so I'm going to kind of talk about these deployment and then technical barriers really quickly. But basically, one of the most significant issues in terms of deployment barriers is related to the cost at commercial scale. And so developers are often have some issues with access to private sector financing when it comes to development of geothermal resources. So as a result, geothermal will struggle to compete with other technologies, despite that value that it can bring, which is that dispatchable power. It's firm, it's flexible, the opportunity to add on storage or to add on cascaded heat. That is challenging to communicate to utilities and to folks that are providing, private equity and financing for these companies that are trying to develop resources that are inherently challenging to develop, because we can't tell you exactly how much we're going to produce before we drill a well, but we need money to drill a well. Wells can cost millions of dollars, and therein is a little bit of the initial challenge. So in addition, we have some regulatory hurdles that are relatively significant. This is something our office is working quite hard on with our partner agencies. Department of Interior has a number of Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service that are Fish and Wildlife that are all involved in permitting for geothermal. But the bottom line is, the longer it takes to permit something, the more it costs to the developer. And so if we have extensive timelines that are leaving projects sort of idle for many years, sometimes developers lose investors, and sometimes they are just unable to continue to pay for the operation of a site and have to shut down. So it's pretty important to help address some of those permitting challenges. And as we see deployment increase, we're really focused on trying to make sure that states have what they need to develop, if they don't have them already, regulations that are going to help streamline development, because there's a whole other set of development that has to, or permitting permits that need to be issued from a state level as well, in addition to if we're operating on federal land, which is where those dramatic timelines and delays are generally seen. So the other piece is just economies of scale. I would say, like, we all know that the more of something, the more development there is, the cheaper the product can be. We haven't had that necessary economy of scale in geothermal. We have seen that in oil and gas. We've seen it in other industries, and obviously in solar. And the opportunity for the growth of economies of scale to reduce cost means we can deploy more, which means we have a learning curve that helps us reduce costs because we're just out there doing more. That whole cycle hasn't necessarily been able to kick off because we haven't had the opportunity. So from a technical standpoint, you can see on the bottom, we're talking about tens of thousands of feet below our feet, and that's hot. Those environments are extreme. Think about a couple of miles below your feet, and the only way that you can access that is from a wellbore that's, around this big. So it's not really easy to see what's happening in the subsurface. We're accessing the rock in the subsurface via these small, basically think of a big drinking straw that's made of steel, that's in the that we drill into the subsurface to 5,000 to 12,000 feet deep. And we're talking about temperatures, as you saw on that thermometer, that are pretty high. And so one of our biggest challenges is not only are the temperatures high, but for enhanced geothermal systems, we're working very hard rocks as well. So the kind of rocks that you might have on your countertops, granitic rocks, not the type of rock that they're working in oil and gas. So some of those technology transfer opportunities aren't there because these are a little bit more challenging environments. There's also some naturally occurring fluids that are hanging around down there that are pretty caustic. So, and then again, back to this learning curve idea, oil and gas is drilling thousands of wells a year, and geothermal is drilling 10 to 20. And so we have a lot less data, and we have a lot less opportunity to perfect our methods in the field. So as a result, we often don't have tools that can function in these higher temperature environments. Conventional geothermal, totally doing fine. Where, as I said, we're a world leader. But as we advance into these higher temperature environments, and as we try to work in these harder rocks for EGS, there are some technologies that have yet to be developed or need to be modified in order to get us the information we need about the ground, the subsurface, and the rock to create reservoirs that are going to be sustainable and cost effective. So what we're trying to do with this Earthshot effort, if we actually see funding that can support it, is looking for opportunities for experiential learning, to be in the field, to demonstrate these projects at scale, and kind of basically understand what the subsurface is going to do, try to predict it, and then try to control it ourselves and outsmart those rocks. So one of the things that we're doing in DOE already to advance EGS is a lot of field work. And our biggest field effort is called FORGE, the Frontier Observatory for Research in Geothermal Energy. This is a project that's been underway since 2014 and is located in Utah, run by the University of Utah and located in Milford, Utah, so about 2-3 hours south of Salt Lake City. And this is a collaborative effort. We really feel strongly, I feel strongly, that collaboration across the subsurface community is what's going to solve this problem and help us address our barriers. And so we're working across the community to study, test, retest how to effectively create and sustain EGS reservoirs. And what we wanted to do is position our industry to be able to take the learnings from this big field laboratory, we like to call it, where DOE, the Department of Energy, and the government took on the risk, and then translated into their field work and their deployment from an industry perspective. And we're seeing that that's already happening, which is amazing and really exciting and very validating for us who've been trying to get this off the ground for a long time. And it's all the more reason to continue sort of the concerted effort to advance EGS through the Earthshot. But I'll just tell you a little bit about what Forge has done. We've drilled, multiple wells in the order of 8 or so wells. They've made tremendous strides in increasing the ability, our ability to drill wells efficiently. And so our last well that we drilled was drilled at basically twice the industry standard. We were able to reduce the time of drilling a well by 80%. So what that means, because drilling is such a humongous cost for geothermal development, reducing that cost by doing it faster. We're paying in some cases $30,000 a day for this big rig you see here in the photo. Imagine you predict you're going to need a rig to drill to 12,000 feet. You might need it for 2 months. If you can drill that in, like oil and gas in some cases is drilling wells in days, that is a dramatic savings in cost. So this is a major advance that we're really excited about. And as I alluded to, something that we're seeing industry actually practically deploy for their wells that they're drilling. One company specifically that has had a major success in EGS has deployed a lot of the techniques and technologies we're working at Forge. So we drilled also 2 nearly horizontal wells, the first time anybody's done that in geothermal. So we really have to commend our Utah team, and also have stimulated that well is what we call it. Basically, we're reopening these fractures, creating fractures to connect the 2 wells together. So there's rock for water to flow through to pick up heat. And the other thing that we're doing at Forge is, like I said, kind of trying to bring the community together. We also competitively provide money to the community and researchers in the community to come and bring their tools and technologies to our Utah site that we have now kind of rigged up in a pretty sweet way. It's highly characterized, lots of opportunities for deployment and testing that don't exist elsewhere. So positioning the industry again to be successful. We're also, as I said, very, very focused on field deployment. So we have a couple of other opportunities. You may have heard of the bipartisan infrastructure law. We're pretty excited about this policy. It also, not just because it's sort of a game changer in terms of climate legislation, but it has allowed a significant tranche of funding for enhanced geothermal systems demonstration projects. And what we're doing with this funding that we are very lucky to have is launching 4 types of demonstrations in varied locations and geologic conditions. And that's really important because we can learn so much at Forge, but that's just one rock type. That's just one stress and structural environment and one temperature regime. And we need to make sure that this technology advances that we have are translatable across the varied geology of the subsurface in the United States. Most of it is, again, in that metamorphic and igneous regime of rock, but we need to ensure that we're perfecting our systems and that we're doing that kind of learning by doing over and over to make sure that we've got this down and it becomes a manufacturing effort as opposed to a one-off R&D effort. So that's what we're very excited about right now. We're reviewing the proposals on this funding opportunity and really excited to launch hopefully a couple of new demonstrations out in the field, a little smaller scale than Forge, but but again, out in the field in new geologies, run by industry and academic and other partners. Also, kind of in that same vein, looking to that I alluded to earlier about the relevance of those knowledge, skills, and abilities of the oil and gas industry and the similarities in the technology space, where we've tried to develop an effort where we can connect the geothermal and oil and gas industries to leverage those technologies, to leverage the assets, meaning wellbore, that well that exists that we could potentially use for geothermal that might exist. They spent a couple $1 million on it. And if we can produce power from it or produce heat from it, then that's a huge savings. And then also create workforce programs to help transition workers. So we just launched this consortium effort. They're also going to be issuing competitive solicitations, trying to get the community engaged on tech transfer, on getting in the field and demonstrating, and then on workforce programs. And then finally, just kind of going back to that space of using oil and gas wells. What can we do with oil and gas wells? There's millions of them that are currently plugged and abandoned in the United States. We have an effort where we've worked with a couple of different institutions to try to see if hot water might have been previously coming up with oil and gas, and now that oil and gas well is not operational, can we still access that hot water? We have one project in Oklahoma that's taking hot water out of an old oil and gas well and bringing it to a local school for heating and cooling. So we're pretty excited about that as well. So in summary, EGS, why should you care? We have a lot of stranded heat. It's there. Nobody's doing anything with it. So why shouldn't we? It's clean. It's efficient. It's an incredible opportunity to decarbonize, to provide firm, flexible power. It can enable other types of resources, agriculture, heating and cooling for our homes and communities, and industrial processes. And as long as we can address some of those technical and non-technical barriers, we can get there. So the last two pieces I'll just share, I'm going to skip the Inflation Reduction Act because that's on the internet. But just to say that I wanted to say geothermal heat pumps, they're literally in your backyard. We have a new effort on this as well that is focused on bringing communities together to deploy heating and cooling in their neighborhoods, and to develop workforce training programs to help build the workforce that needs to install these and manufacture heat pumps. So here's the location of those projects. We're pretty excited to see that a number, and one of the goals was to help communities that have been negatively impacted and address environmental justice concerns. And we're very excited to have this as a continuing portion of our portfolio to provide low cost and very clean heating and cooling to communities around the country. So lastly, I would just say if you're interested in anything I shared, you can always get in touch with me. I love emails and from folks in the community, but we also have incredible communications materials working on that communication challenge that we have in geothermal. And our comms team works so hard at this to try to make digestible materials that people can use and share. So please check out our website, sign up for our newsletter, The Drill Down, and you can find out anything you might want to know about our programs or about geothermal in general. So that's all for me, and our newsletter is really fun. So if you're interested, and it has all the latest and greatest updates.
Yeah, you guys have your own webinars as well. So I've gone and attended a lot of different Department of Energy webinars, and I've learned quite a bit.
I love it.
Specifically being a non-science trained person. So. And I do get the drill down and read it, so it is a good source of information. I'm going to pose a question here, and it is by Babette. So I've heard this question from a couple other people. EGS skeptics worry about the potential for earthquakes as a result of EGS fracking. Do you agree there is such a potential? If so, what is the Department of Energy recommending to prevent or minimize earthquake risks?
Yes, this is a major part of our portfolio, and a very good question. So anytime anyone is injecting fluid into the subsurface, whether it's in the mining industry, in wastewater injection, in oil and gas, there's a risk that you are changing the stress conditions in the subsurface. And all that means is that if you change the balance of stress in the subsurface, it can create induced seismicity. So there's absolutely a risk of all subsurface industries for seismicity. What I will say is that our office has worked really hard with the international community and the research community in the US to develop a best practices document, and requires all of our projects that we fund, which are the only EGS projects out there except one commercial entity right now, to follow this very rigorous process for assessing the opportunity, the potential for seismicity, and then developing a clear mitigation plan for seismicity if it occurs. But the caveat I want to provide is just that when one does the due diligence that they should as part of this mitigation plan and our protocol, you can identify if you're nearby any sort of structural element that could create large scale seismicity. And that's when you know you need to move on, and that's not a place you should develop a project. So we've had a 100% success rate in terms of no seismicity that has been damaging or felt by communities, and because of the protocols and mitigation strategies that we've used. But we are extremely sensitive to ensuring that communities are aware of this, are aware of seismicity, understand the risks. And that's also a major part of our project, and part of this protocol is that all communities nearby projects that we're funding are brought into the mix, educated, questions are answered prior to any activity happening, and then shown those mitigation strategies, and those, we call them stoplight, basically procedures. So if we see seismicity at this level, we do this. If we see seismicity at this level, we stop. So all that said, the seismicity that we're talking about is not really even felt. It's called microseismicity because it's below 0 magnitude. But we're doing everything we can with those mitigation procedures and protocols to ensure that no felt seismicity does occur. And I'd be happy to send those documents anybody's way. We're very proud of them, and we're really proud of the impacts that they've had on making sure that this is a safe operational environment.
Thank you. I've already learned so much, Lauren. The next question is from an anonymous attendee. How much water is required to operate enhanced geothermal systems? Is water lost in the subsurface during the process? Is it typical to inject only water, or do they use a solution with chemicals? And if so, what types of chemicals?
Yeah, what good questions. You have such an amazing stakeholder group. So yes, typically we're using water. Some entities are using basically treated effluent water up in the geysers, for example, which is a field that's in Northwest California, north of San Francisco. They're using water that is, I think it's called gray water, basically. I can't remember if it's gray water. And so there's not really any competition in terms of the use of that water for agricultural or for drinking water purposes. The same thing is happening at Forge. We're using water from the site that is not usable or potable by any means or stretch, because of the amount of basically chemistry that exists in the naturally exists in the water. So what we try to do is utilize not to take away water resources from anyone else. So we're doing our best to utilize water that is not potable, so it's not in direct competition or conflict with other needs. The question of water loss is a really interesting and good one. In EGS systems, at least in the EGS systems that we have been part of funding, there is very, very minimal water loss. And the reason that we think, but again, this is still a new a new area of study, we're estimating below 10% water loss in the lifetime of an EGS system. We're working to validate those numbers, but what we see in the fields that were operational in the US is that the type of rock we're working in is just so impermeable, meaning like there's just not a lot of places for the water to go, as opposed to, sandstones or other sort of more porous rocks that we might see in other environments and that oil and gas is working in, and where fluid can sort of permeate through it, and there's a lot of existing fractures where the water can go. So it's a really good question. I think as the more we develop EGS, the more we'll know about how much water is lost in the subsurface. But for the data that we do have, which is quite credible at this point, is it's quite low just because of the way that the geologies that we're working in.
Okay, Lauren, I have a question of my own. I know that when it comes to the water that's injected and that comes back up, I've heard in relation to uh you know regular old geothermal energy that have out in California and Iceland and other places, that oftentimes one of the things that comes back up is lithium. And
Yeah,
and I know that's a big concern for a lot of people, of the mining of lithium, and do we have enough of it? We use it for our cell phones, obviously we're going to be using it for electric cars more and more. And I just is that a common thing? Is that kind of a I always think about like oil companies. Like I know we can have oil company workers move over to EGS, which would be great, right? EGS starts working, and these barriers start being overcome, that American and other oil companies start saying, hey, let's move over in this, and you know what I mean, like make that
yeah.
position. I know there's organizations out there trying to make that happen, but I'm just curious, is there going to be kind of like a side hustle for these companies, like we got your geothermal heat and electricity, but we also can
Absolutely.
sell this lithium to battery makers.
Yes, that is a great question. And yeah, we do hope to see that oil and gas companies might say like, hey, we can do this too, at some point, just because they have the expertise and infrastructure. But for sure, to your point on the workforce, we want those skilled workers in geothermal as well, to expand our workforce as the industry grows. But your point is spot on. There's lots of chemistry in the subsurface. When we put water into the subsurface, naturally, different types of minerals might, we call it precipitate, but might basically come into solution. And oftentimes we see silica, and that can actually be kind of annoying for the operators, because they just have these naturally occurring minerals precipitating in their well bores as they're bringing the temperature down, or as the temperature decreases as this hot fluid comes to the surface. So they have to deal with a lot of chemistry. But one beneficial aspect of that chemistry is that in some cases there can be really valuable materials in it. So I wouldn't say that lithium is going to be a home run for every geothermal development, but there are some places in the United States, for example, the Salton Sea in California, Southern California, has geothermal brines that have lithium resources that could basically provide multiple times over the world's need for electric vehicle batteries and cell phone batteries, basically incredibly vast supply of lithium. And there's quite a race right now to try to develop the technologies, call it direct lithium extraction technologies, different membranes and different chemistries that can selectively pull lithium out of the brine, to help access that lithium and allow a domestic source of lithium, because currently the United States is reliant on many other countries, some of which we don't have great relationships with, for lithium. So geothermal can be a really key player. I would say much more localized, because there's a really vast resource in the Salton Sea, and we can't say that is the same. That's the case for other areas in the U.S. But man, oh man, is there a lot in California, and that domestic supply would be incredibly valuable, and from an energy security standpoint. Oh, and you know what? I just realized in the interim, if there's no other questions, I didn't answer one part of the previous question in terms of what's injected with water. So, we're trying to, as I mentioned, not use potable water, if we can, but there's nothing injected in the fluid except something we've been experimenting with recently is called proppant. But what we're using for proppant is sand. And so the idea of proppant is basically that there are these little tiny fractures in the rock, that reopen when we put in cold water, and we keep them open by putting stuff inside of them. And what we're using is sand, very fine grained sand. So that's right now something that's being experimented with. It's not traditionally done in geothermal, but at Forge we're experimenting with that, and some commercial entities are experimenting with it too. The idea of like, how can we sustain these reservoirs? And that's a that's one thing that's being injected as a result. Otherwise, just water.
So Mary Baker asked, does extracting geothermal disrupt or harm particular natural ecosystems, and how might that be mitigated?
Yeah, great question. Hi, Mary. So we're actually looking at some doing some follow-on studies on this right now. But because of the small footprint of geothermal, there's really no documented impacts to ecosystems whatsoever that we have from the development of conventional geothermal. There are cultural concerns in other countries with respect to impacting hot springs, which have cultural significance in other countries, especially Japan, for example. That if we develop geothermal resources, is that going to reduce the amount of water that might be in a natural hot spring that is very important in Japanese culture? I think the jury is still out even on that, depending on the proximity, but it's taken quite seriously. And I would say from an ecological standpoint, we are required to do very serious and extensive surveys on wildlife before operations begin, especially if we're working on federal land, but states have the same restrictions. We are counting species and tracking them, and if there are any species that are on the endangered list or approaching that, the regulators take that very, very seriously. There's a sage grouse, for example, that lives in the western US. That's a beautiful bird that is often co-located with where geothermal resources are. And so there's very strict requirements around not being in the field when those birds are nesting. But otherwise, it's more just don't get in their way when they're nesting, not that we're going to hurt them when operations are taking place.
Here's a question from Heidi. Old unused oil and gas wells continue to emit methane. So wouldn't using those wells for geothermal create an issue with methane emissions and climate change?
Yeah, fair question. That's so because we're kind of just experimenting in this space. I don't have a data-driven answer to that question, but I think it's a very good one. I think that my inclination as a scientist would be that if as these wells are operated, and folks on the line, if you're in oil and gas, get on the phone and tell me I'm wrong, because this is something we can look into and should. But as oil and gas wells are operated and there's lower and lower oil cut and higher water cut, those methane emissions are coming from the hydrocarbons. And so the lower amount of hydrocarbon, the lower the emissions would be. So I think it's a very fair point. If we're looking at wellbore that are, have no hydrocarbons left, but are just basically conduits to hot water resources, then maybe it's not a big challenge. But I think that we need to do some analysis on that. And I think it's a really good idea.
And I'll sneak in a 350 related question from Darlan. 350 Colorado is spearheading a ballot initiative to phase out new permits for fracking for oil and gas. How would you recommend the ballot initiative be phrased so that it would not inadvertently prevent permits for EGS?
Oh, wow. That's an amazingly important question, because I think we're seeing this challenge. That challenge is played out in France, where there was a fracking ban, and it did create quite a bit of challenge for enhanced geothermal systems operators. If it would be okay, I'd love to get back in touch with you on that, because it might be something that we need to craft pretty carefully. But I very much appreciate that question, and I think it's the distinction between the two is really important to make. So thank you for asking it. Is it okay if we stay in touch, or maybe I can some of the 350 organizers can help put me in touch with
Darlan,
the question asker? Okay.
With myself and was asking the question after this.
Oh, that's amazing. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think we could make a distinction in terms of the way that, just my quick off the top of my head thoughts, the way that in the injection is happening is rather different from oil and gas versus EGS. And the environment that it's taking place in, if those could be distinctions that were outlined, but I'd love to talk to the rest of my team to see if they, in our policy office, if they have some recommendations.
Thomas has a question. What U.S. universities offer degrees in geothermal energy, and is that adequate?
Oh yeah, what a great question. No, it's not adequate. And there are very few. University of Nevada, Reno is a major player in the space, in terms of just the conventional geothermal from a power production side. Texas is really stepping up in terms of their reservoir engineering folks for oil and gas are spending a lot of time in developing new curricula on geothermal power, which is pretty cool. And then traditionally there was a kind of nexus of heating and cooling work happening in Oregon, in Klamath Falls, but those folks have retired. And so I can't say that we know where there are universities that are focused on heating and cooling right now, which is a real significant need. But I'd say Nevada, Texas, Oklahoma is doing quite a bit of work with curriculum in this space, but it would be great to see more.
There's been reports that the fossil fuel majors, BP, Chevron, et cetera, have made small exploratory investments in EGS. How realistic is it for the USA's fossil fuel industry and utilities transition the majority of their capital brainpower toward geothermal technologies by 2050? Are DOE incentives a realistic option for accelerating this?
Oh, wow, that's a phenomenal question. I would love to know what your the folks that are part of 350 Chicago and Colorado, what sectors you all work in, because these are the best questions I've ever had at a webinar. So I'm super excited to talk through this stuff. I do not think that the current incentives for transitioning personally are enough to transition oil and gas into this space, because obviously there's quite a bit of money to be made in the oil and gas industry, and there have been minimal investments so far from a couple of majors. I would say one specifically is leading the way and has historically been very engaged, Chevron, in geothermal. They were the operator of major fields in the Western US in the 80s and 90s, and then transitioned away, and they're back interested in it. But others in the mid-range are quite interested as well. Some oil companies from Europe and some based in Colorado, actually. Oxy is really leading the way in a very earnest and thoughtful fashion, and I've been really impressed with working with them. So I do think that the knowledge, skills, abilities, workforce has a lot to offer when it comes to operating in geothermal, and our industry is so small, we could use more folks. But I can't speak to, just because I'm a humble geologist, what it's going to take from a business perspective to get them to transition over. And I do know that the programs that we're developing are just the first. The Geode program I mentioned is just the first, and a small piece of what's going to, I think, be needed to help realistically transition a portion of the oil and gas work. I don't think we're expecting that oil and gas companies will become solely geothermal companies, because they're pursuing offshore wind, hydrogen, quite a few other renewable technologies across the different mid-size and major companies. But we think that it has an amazing opportunity to transition a part of their energy mix in the future.
Lauren, this has been wonderful. I wish we could talk about this for another hour. This is fascinating to me. You explain things so well. It makes it the difficult science, and I know there's just hours and hours. I mean, we could take a whole course in this, right? Just geothermal,
Totally.
EGS 101, I assume. So I really thank you for taking the time to join us. And I thank your team. I thank Corin, especially, for helping me set this up. I really thank 350 Colorado for joining us in this joint endeavor. I hope it's not the last one. I hope we can keep doing more of these.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to connect.
We're going to keep it up.